Chapter 7. A Nameless Visitor. Tuesday, September 11, 11:15 a.m. Heath had stepped out into the hall, and now returned with the day telephone operator, a sallow, thin young man who, we learned, was named Spively. His almost black hair, which accentuated the pallor of his face, was sleeked back from his forehead with pomade, and he wore a very shallow mustache which barely extended beyond the alley of his nostrils. He was dressed in an exaggeratedly dapper fashion, in a dazzling chocolate-colored suit cut very close to his figure, a pair of cloth-topped buttoned shoes, and a pink shirt with a stiff turn-over collar to match. He appeared nervous, and immediately sat down in a wicker chair by the door, fingering the sharp creases of his trousers, and running the tip of his tongue over his lips. Markham went straight to the point. "I understand you were at the switchboard yesterday afternoon and last night until 10 o'clock. Is that correct?" Spively swallowed hard and nodded his head. "Yes, sir." "What time did Miss Odell go out to dinner?" "About 7 o'clock. I had just sent to the restaurant next door for some sandwiches." "Did she go alone?" Markham interrupted his explanation. "No, a fella called for her." "Did you know this fella?" "I'd seen him a couple of times calling on Miss Odell, but I didn't know who he was." "What did he look like?" Markham's question was uttered with hurried impatience. Spively's description of the girl's escort tallied with Jessup's description of the man who had accompanied her home, though Spively was more voluble and less precise than Jessup had been. Patently, Miss Odell had gone out at 7 and returned at 11 with the same man. "Now," resumed Markham, putting an added stress on his words, "I want to know who else called Miss Odell between the time she went out to dinner and 10 o'clock when you left the switchboard." Spively was puzzled by the question, and his thin arched eyebrows lifted and contracted. "I don't understand," he stammered. "How could anyone call on Miss Odell when she was out?" "Someone evidently did," said Markham, "and he had got into her apartment and was there when she returned at 11. The youth's eyes opened wide, and his lips fell apart. "My God, sir!" he exclaimed. "So that's how they murdered her, laid in wait for her." He stopped abruptly, suddenly realizing his own proximity to the mysterious chain of events that had led to the crime. "But nobody got into her apartment while I was on duty," he blurted, with frightening emphasis. "Nobody. I never left the board from the time she went out until quitting time." "Couldn't anyone have come in the side door?" "What? Was it unlocked?" Spively's tone was startled. "It never is unlocked at night. The janitor bolts it when he leaves at 6. "And you didn't unbolt it last night for any purpose? Think." "No, sir, I didn't." He shook his head earnestly. "And you're positive that no one got into the apartment through the front door after Miss Odell left?" "Positive. I tell you I didn't leave the board the whole time, and nobody could have got by me without my knowing it. There was only one person that called and asked for her." "Oh, so someone did call," snapped Markham. "When was it? And what happened? Jog your memory before you answer." "It wasn't anything important," the youth assured him, genuinely frightened. "Just a fellow who came in and rang her bell and went right out again." "Never mind whether it was important or not." Markham's tone was cold and peremptory. "What time did he call?" "About 9:30. "And who was he?" "A young fella I've seen come here several times to see Miss Odell. I don't know his name." "Tell me exactly what took place," pursued Markham. Again Spively swallowed hard and wetted his lips. "It was like this," he began with effort. "The fella came in and started walking down the hall, and I said to him, 'Miss Odell isn't in.' But he kept on going and said, 'Oh well, I'll ring the bell anyway to make sure.' A telephone call came through just then, and I let him go on. He rang the bell and knocked on the door, but of course there wasn't any answer, and pretty soon he came on back and said, 'I guess you were right.' Then he tossed me $50 and went out." "You actually saw him go out?" There was a note of disappointment in Markham's voice. "Sure, I saw him go out. He stopped inside the front door and lit a cigarette. Then he opened the door and turned toward Broadway." "One by one the rosy petals fall," came Vance's indolent voice. "An amusing situation." Markham was loath to relinquish his hope in the criminal possibilities of this one caller who had come and gone at 9:30. "What was the man like?" he asked. "Can you describe him?" Spively sat up straight, and when he answered, it was with an enthusiasm that showed he had taken special note of the visitor. "He was good-looking, Not so old, maybe 30. And he had on a full-dress suit and patent leather pumps and a pleated silk shirt. What? Demanded Vance, in simulated unbelief, leaning over the back of the Davenport. A silk shirt with evening dress. Most extraordinary. Oh, a lot of best dressers are wearing them, Spively explained, with condescending pride. It's all the fashion for dancing. You don't say, really? Vance appeared dumbfounded. I must look into this. And, by the by, when this Beau Brummel of the silk shirt paused by the front door, did he take his cigarette from a long flat silver case carried in his lower waistcoat pocket? The youth looked at Vance in admiring astonishment. How did you know? He exclaimed. Simple deduction, Vance explained, resuming his recumbent posture. Large metal cigarette cases carried in the waistcoat pocket somehow go with silk shirts for evening wear. Markham, clearly annoyed at the interruption, cut in sharply with a demand for the operator to proceed with his description. He wore his hair smoothed down, Spively continued, and you could see it was kind of long, but it was cut in the latest style. And he had a small waxed mustache, and there was a big carnation in the lapel of his coat, and he had on chamois gloves. My word, murmured Vance, a gigolo! Markham, with the incubus of the nightclubs riding him heavily, frowned and took a deep breath. Vance's observation evidently had launched him on an unpleasant train of thought. Was this man short or tall? He asked next. He wasn't so tall, about my height, Spively explained, and he was sort of thin. There was an easily recognizable undercurrent of admiration in his tone, and I felt that this youthful telephone operator had seen in Miss Odell's caller a certain physical and sartorial ideal. This palpable admiration, coupled with the somewhat outre clothes affected by the youth, permitted us to read between the lines of his remarks a fairly accurate description of the man who had unsuccessfully rung the dead girl's bell at 9:30 the night before. When Spively had been dismissed, Markham rose and strode about the room, his head enveloped in a cloud of cigar smoke, while Heath sat stolidly watching him, his brows knit. Vance stood up and stretched himself. The absorbent problem, it would seem, remains in statu quo, he remarked airily. How, oh how, did the fair Margaret's executioner get in? You know, Markham, rumbled Heath sententiously, I've been thinking that the fellow may have come here earlier in the afternoon, say, before that side door was locked. Odell herself may have let him in and hidden him when the other man came to take her to dinner. It looks that way, Markham admitted. Bring the maid in here again, and we'll see what we can find out. When the woman had been brought in, Markham questioned her as to her actions during the afternoon, and learned that she had gone out at about 4 to do some shopping, and had returned about 5:30. Did Miss Odell have any visitor with her when you got back? No, sir, was the prompt answer. She was alone. Did she mention that anyone had called? No, sir. Now, continued Markham, could anyone have been hidden in this apartment when you went home at 7? The maid was frankly astonished, and even a little horrified. Where can anyone hide? She asked, looking round the apartment. There are several possible places, Markham suggested. In the bathroom, in one of the clothes closets, under the bed, behind the window draperies. The woman shook her head decisively. No one could have been hidden, she declared. I was in the bathroom 6 times, and I got Miss Odell's gown out of the clothes closet in the bedroom. As soon as it began to get dark, I drew all the window shades myself, and as for the bed, it's built almost down to the floor. No one could squeeze under it. I glanced closely at the bed, and realized that the statement was quite true. What about the clothes closet in this room? Markham put the question hopefully, but again the maid shook her head. Nobody was in there. That's where I keep my own hat and coat, and I took them out myself when I was getting ready to go. I even put away one of Miss Odell's old dresses in that closet before I left. And you're absolutely certain, reiterated Markham, that no one could have been hidden anywhere in these rooms at any time you went home? Absolutely, sir. Did you happen to remember if the key of this clothes closet was on the inside or the outside of the lock when you opened the door to get your hat? The woman paused and looked thoughtfully at the closet door. It was on the outside, where it always was, she announced, after several moments' reflection. I remember because it caught on the chiffon of the old dress I put away. Markham frowned and then resumed his questioning. You say you don't know the name of Miss Odell's dinner companion last night. Can you tell us the names of any men she was in the habit of going out with? Miss Odell never mentioned any names to me, the woman said. She was very careful about it too, secretive, you might say. You see, I'm only here in the daytime, and the gentlemen she knew generally came in the evening. And you never heard her speak of anyone of whom she was frightened, anyone she had reason to fear? No, sir, although there was one man she was trying to get rid of. He was a bad character. I wouldn't have trusted him anywhere, and I told Miss Odell she'd better look out for him. But she'd known him a long time, I guess, and had been pretty soft on him once. How do you happen to know this? One day, about a week ago, the maid explained. I came in after lunch, and he was with her in the other room. They didn't hear me, because the portieres were drawn. He was demanding money, and when she tried to put him off, he began threatening her. And she said something that showed she'd given him money before. I made a noise, and then they stopped arguing, and pretty soon he went out. What did this man look like? Markham's interest was reviving. He was kind of thin, not very tall. I'd say he was around 30. He had a hard face, good looking, some would say, and pale blue eyes that gave you the shivers. He always wore his hair greased back, and he had a little yellow mustache pointed at the ends. Ah, said Vance, our gigolo. Has this man been here since? Asked Markham. I don't know, sir, not when I was here. That'll be all, said Markham, and the woman went out. She didn't help us much, complained Heath. What? Exclaimed Vance. I think she did remarkably well. She cleared up several moot points. And just what portions of her information do you consider particularly illuminating? Asked Markham, with ill-concealed annoyance. We now know, do we not, rejoined Vance serenely, that no one was lying perdu in here when the bond departed yester evening. Instead of that fact being helpful, retorted Markham, I'd say it added materially to the complications of the situation. It would appear that way, wouldn't it now? But then, who knows, it may prove to be your brightest and most comforting clue. Furthermore, we learned that someone evidently locked himself in that clothes press, as witnessed the shifting of the key, and that, moreover, this occultation did not occur until the Abigail had gone, or, let us say, after 7 o'clock. Sure, said Heath with sour facetiousness, when the side door was bolted and an operator was sitting in the front hall, who swears nobody came in that way. It is a bit mystifying, Vance conceded sadly. Mystifying? It's impossible, grumbled Markham. Heath, who was now staring with meditative pugnacity into the closet, shook his head helplessly. What I don't understand, he ruminated, is why, if the fellow was hiding in the closet, he didn't ransack it when he came out, like he did all the rest of the apartment. Sergeant, said Vance, you've put your finger on the crux of the matter. You know, the neat, undisturbed aspect of that closet rather suggests that the crude person who rifled these charming rooms omitted to give it his attention because it was locked on the inside and he couldn't open it. Come, come, protested Markham. That theory implies that there were 2 unknown persons in here last night. Vance sighed. Hurrah and alas, I know it. And we can't introduce even one into this apartment logically. Distressing, ain't it? Heath sought consolation in a new line of thought. Anyway, he submitted, we know that the fancy fellow with the patent leather pumps who called here last night at 9:30 was probably Odell's lover, and was grafting on her. And in just what recondite way does that obvious fact help to roll the clouds away? Asked Vance. Nearly every modern Delilah has an avaricious amoroso. It would be rather singular if there wasn't such a chap in the offing, what? That's all right too, returned Heath. But I'll tell you something, Mr. Vance, that maybe you don't know. The men that these girls lose their heads over are generally crooks of some kind, professional criminals, you understand. That's why, knowing that this job was the work of a professional, it don't leave me cold, as you might say, to learn that this fellow who was threatening Odell and grafting on her was the same one who was prowling round here last night. And I'll say this too, the description of him sounds a whole lot like the kind of high-class burglars that hang out at these swell all-night cafes. You are convinced, then, asked Vance mildly, that this job, as you call it, was done by a professional criminal? Heath was almost contemptuous in his reply. Didn't the guy wear gloves and use a jimmy? It was a yeggman's job, all right.